Okay, my name is Preston Werner. I'm going to be presenting on ImageScience, which is a image library, and the new Gravatar.com. And in case you're not aware, Gravatar.com is a service that I run that allows you to associate a small image with your email address. And currently it's been down because I've been rewriting the new version and solving some scalability issues. It gets quite a bit of traffic, as you can imagine. So ImageScience ImageScience is a library that was just recently released by Ryan Davis from Seattle. He's done a lot of things for the Ruby community. ImageScience is one of his latest projects. What it is a lightweight replacement for RMagick and ImageMagick. So if you're using Ruby and you're doing some sort of image manipulation, you've probably seen ImageMagick. ImageMagick is a graphics library written in C. That's pretty standard for people to use. There's ImageMagick and GraphicsMagick. Both are forked from the same code base, and they do all sorts of graphics manipulations kinds of things. And RMagick is a binding for Ruby. So you would install ImageMagick on your server, for instance, and you would use RMagick in your code to do things like creating thumbnails, doing overlays, doing simple line drawings, and that kind of thing on images. So RMagick is great, but it's gotten pretty big. It has some memory issues occasionally, and ImageMagick is always kind of a pain in the ass to set up on a server and on the Mac and on basically anything you could ever want to set it up on. It takes a little fiddling with. And so what ImageScience does is provides a binding to another library called FreeImage. And FreeImage does the same sorts of things that ImageMagick does in a little bit different way. It tends to be a little bit easier to install, but there's still some problems with the makefile that hopefully will be solved, but it's relatively simple to install. And ImageScience is lightweight. As you'll see later, I'll show you the code. So what ImageScience is great for is if you need to do thumbnails, if you're accepting people to upload images and you want to thumbnail them or do some resizing, ImageScience is really great for that. It's super easy to set up. It's extremely small. And I just recently started using it with Gravatar. I was using ImageMagick before, just calling it via command line calls. Since I didn't want to deal with RMagick, I didn't think I needed that. But ImageScience is lightweight enough that it makes sense to use for the simple kinds of things that I need to do with it. So let me do a little demonstration of Gravatar 2.0. In case you've seen the old Gravatar, this looks quite a bit different. And this is all built in Ruby on Rails now. So I'm going to log into my account. And the interface for the new Gravatar will show you all of the email addresses that you have with your account. And it will show you all of the Gravatars that you've associated. So now you'll be able to have multiple email addresses and multiple Gravatars. So you can upload as many as you want and then switch between them sort of willy-nilly as the mood strikes you. So what I wanted to be able to do was accept any size image that you could possibly find for yourself and basically any image format. And ImageScience allows me to do this in a very simple way. So let's say I want to add a new Gravatar, and I want to choose to upload it from my hard drive. And I'll look for an image here. I think I have one here. This is the Mighty Cthulhu. And it'll upload it, and it will give you the cropper that Chris Van Pelt has so kindly authored for me. He's in the audience. So now you'll be able to actually crop your image right in Gravatar. You don't need to size it or do anything. You don't need to make sure it's square. Before, with the old Gravatar, you had to make sure it was square, it would distort it, and all kinds of nasty things. So you can actually drag this guy around, and it will be constrained within the limits of the thing. This is all the JavaScript stuff that Chris did, nothing really having to do with ImageScience, but what it did do was make sure that the image that I selected was between 80 by 80 pixels and 800 by 800 pixels, which allows it to be a reasonable size on the screen once it comes in. So if you upload a massive image, it'll turn it into whatever 800 as the maximum dimension, so that it'll fit nicely on the screen. And if you upload a very small image, like 10 by 10 pixels, it'll actually scale that up to 80 by 80 because it needs to be at least that big. So I can fiddle with the size here, select my crop, and go crop. So now what it has to do is, given the dimensions that I selected, ImageScience will give you the opportunity to crop to those dimensions and then do additional scaling from there. And just to show you a little bit of what Gravatar 2 does, you rate your own now, so it's immediate feedback, no more waiting days, which will be nice. And as you can see, it shows up right here. So now that you can see what you can do with ImageScience, I'll show you a little bit of the code of how to do that. And it's really simple. The interface, the API is super slick for this. So let's say I want to create a thumbnail, and in ImageScience parlance, a thumbnail is a resize of an image only downward. Thumbnail only goes downward, so you can only make a file smaller. And it will scale it to a dimension so that the longest dimension of that change is what you specify. So in this case, I do ImageScience.withImage. I give it the file name and give it a block, and into the block is passed a variable img here. And with that, I can do thumbnail, called the thumbnail method, and tell it what the output file name is, and give it a dimension. So if I upload an image that is 1000 by 500, this will scale it down to 800 as the longest dimension, and then whatever the other one would be a little bit smaller than 500, it'd be like 400. So you can do simple thumbnails like that. The other thing that you can do is a cropped thumbnail, and a cropped thumbnail is a square thumbnail. So if I upload something that is, say, 200 by 100, a cropped thumbnail will make it square by just lopping off whatever the leftovers are after scaling it down to the specified dimension. Here it's 80. So it basically does a thumbnail, and then it crops off whatever's square, and it just chooses that in the middle of the selection. So this is by default. If you go and you create a new Gravatar and you don't crop it, and you go back to the list of Gravatars that you have, it will automatically do this for you just to make sure there's something there. So if you don't really care about letting people choose their own selection, their own crop, then you can do this, and it'll basically just size it down to whatever size you want and then just make it square. So if you want square thumbnails, this is what you're going to do. You can get the width and height of the image just as easily as this, and you potentially use that to decide how big you want to make things or what kind of scaling you need to do. If you want to crop an image and then thumbnail it, which is what I do once you hit the crop button, it basically takes out that piece that you specified from the cropper and then thumbnails it, creates it, smashes it down to 80 by 80. So to do that, you do two method calls with blocks. So you do the outer one with the image that you specify, and then you do an inner one with crop, and you specify just the left, top, right, and bottom. And to that, then inside there, with the result of that, then you can do a thumbnail, same as before. ImageScience 1.0, which just came out like a week or two ago, doesn't have the ability to do a resize. I actually needed to be able to upsize in case you uploaded something that was smaller. And so I wrote a resize method on there, and I talked to Ryan Davis today, and he actually has written a resize already that's not been pushed yet, but it will be there. So I assume, I didn't ask him if the parameters are going to be the same, but I would assume so. The resize call that I created just works the same way as thumbnail. You just give it a width and a height, and it will scale it proportionally if you give it proportional, or not if you don't. This will just scale it arbitrarily, which I do when you provide something that's smaller. It'll bring it up to at least 80 by something. I said before that ImageScience will deal with a lot of formats, so you can see them all here. This is what FreeImage can handle. So it'll basically handle anything you can throw at it, which makes it nice for presenting an interface like this to a potentially inexperienced user that doesn't want to have to deal with making sure the file is, a GIF or a JPEG or a PNG. So I highlighted a couple of the most relevant ones. The other ones you're not generally going to see too much, but it can handle them. One of the most interesting ones is it'll actually handle Photoshop files, which is pretty cool. With transparency, if you send it to a PNG file, it will actually preserve transparency and everything. So ImageScience is in version 1, and I modified it so it's a little bit longer. I'll show it to you. But it's only 93 lines. So, oops. I always do that. So the reason it can be so small is Ryan uses Ruby, inline Ruby, which basically you can embed C code right in your Ruby, and it will compile it the next time that it is required by a Ruby file. So you can see that it's including, this is the code for the single file for ImageScience. Basically just declares the prototypes of the methods, and then down here he uses Ruby inline with the builder to specify the C version of the methods. And so this just uses the C API that FreeImage provides for you. So he does some very minimal things. You can see the method name right here with image, with crop. You got height and width. File type I added because I needed to know what file type things were so that I could end up with a JPEG, a GIF, or a PNG. And Resize, which I wrote to let me do that. And then thumbnail. Resize is basically just thumbnail with a different C function call. So originally this is 93 lines of code. Very simple, easy to make sure it's bug-free, super fast download. There's little overhead, so it's very fast. Nothing like RMagick. RMagick is kind of a beast these days. So you've seen the code, you've seen what it can do. There's not a lot to it right now. Ryan wants to keep it really small, really clean, so that people want to use it. I mean, it's just for these kinds of things. You're not going to be doing complicated stuff with this. And for a lot of people, you don't need to and you don't want to. So it's a good alternative to RMagick and ImageMagick. The URL is here if you want to write it down. The video will be available online eventually. I'll put the slides up at some point. Or you can just search for ImageScience and you'll find it pretty quick. So any questions? Anybody think they'll potentially be using this? A couple hands? Good, yeah. So, no questions? Sure, Chris.
What did you said you ran into problems making or compiling the free image or library. Are there tips or tricks there that go on?
Yeah, there are. The question was tips and tricks for compilation if it's an issue. On the ImageMagick or on the ImageScience website, there are a couple tips. He goes over some tips you might want to do for Linux and Mac. For Mac, you have to have Xcode installed with both the 10.4 and 10.8.3. It compiles a dual binary, so you just got to make sure that's installed. So be aware of that. Just do the full Xcode install, and it should work. But yeah, on the website you can find it. Yes?
This might sound dumb, but how is that? What exactly do you mean by associating the email address? How would you use it?
Oh, the question is regarding Gravatar. So let's say you go to a weblog, and you've probably been to weblogs that have avatars by the comments. Yes? Okay. So oftentimes these will be Gravatars. So when you leave a comment at a website and you leave your email address in the form, which oftentimes you will do, the person can install a plugin that Gravatar provides, and it does a hash, an MD5 hash of the email address to come up with basically a key, and then does a request to gravatar.com, which can then look up the correct image and return that. So by doing a simple image call with the specified MD5, it will return the avatar. And you can also do things like specify what maximum rating you want on it. So if you don't want you know, X-rated content. If you're running a site that might be visited by kids, you can say, I only want G-rated gravatars. And you can say, I want it in size 40, and it will actually return a nicely scaled image for you, so you don't have to scale it in the browser. It'll actually use bicubic interpolation and scale it. So that's how Gravatar works. Does that answer your question? Okay. Patrick. The question is the cropper that I showed derived from Chris's? Yes, it is the same exact code. I tweaked it a tiny, tiny bit. And I'll give that back to Chris, and he can decide whether he wants to incorporate that or not. But yep, Chris Van Pelt wrote that.
I was going to overhaul it with that and move tools.
Oh, yeah?
Keep everything light, right?
Good idea. Okay, Rob.
What's the output format you specify, like JPEG?
The question is, how do you specify the output format? And if you look in here, you specify it just by putting it in the file name. So if you want a PNG file, you just say that. If you want a GIF file, you say that. You want a JPEG, you say that. And it just looks at that and determines. Otherwise, it will use whatever the format of the input was. So you don't have to put a file name, but you know, if you want it to be something different than what you sent in, then you specify it in the output file name. Any other questions? Yes, Chris.
When is Gravatar going to be up?
Gravatar will be up, hopefully, in a limited fashion, which is basically what you saw. So you'll be able to actually administrate your stuff, hopefully at the end of January, the end of this month. I hope to have it up again for consumption. Yes?
You said you were dealing with scalability issues. Is that from Rails or is it from the image stuff? Or what? What in the world really common level of the solution?
Okay. The question is, what scaling issues was I having? It has nothing to do with the Rails. I was using PHP before, which is part of the problem. The scaling really came in because so many requests for Gravatars were coming in. I transitioned it over to my own servers. It's running on 2 servers right now, distributed across them, and it's doing something like 2 terabytes per month of throughput. So the old way of serving a Gravatar was basically with PHP. The request would come into a PHP file. PHP would look at the MD5, look it up in the database, pull the image from disk, and then scale it if necessary, and then save it to a cached file. So it was doing some caching, but it was hitting PHP on every single request, and it was generally hitting the database, recording that hit. So this got to be extremely slow. And even turning some of that stuff off didn't help, and PHP is just, in general, unfortunate. So the scaling was just from the quantity of requests, and it really had nothing to do, it didn't have anything to do with Rails. I'm rewriting this in Rails right now. The admin interface shouldn't have any scalability problems. It's not hit that often. The scalability problems come in serving so many requests. At peak, it's doing something like 17,000 requests per second. So there's a lot of them, and serving all of them becomes kind of a challenge, which I've been facing and dealing with right now. Anybody else? Questions regarding Gravatar ImageScience? Okay.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.